you know, some of the things that were really good about the Afghan media can survive. And with me to discuss that, I've got three Afghan working journalists. I've got Ali Latifi, who was born in Kabul, raised in California, is currently and has been for many years back in Afghanistan. Worked briefly for my organization, the Afghanistan Analyst Network, but now is a freelance journalist, writing for various newspapers and publications, Foreign Policy, Middle East Eye, and the New Humanitarian. We have Zahra Nader, who's an Afghan-Canadian journalist, editor of Zan Times, which is I'm sure you're going to explain that more to us, Zahra, in your own words, but it's a media outlet that is really focusing on women's rights and women's lives, I would say, and the lives of minorities in Afghanistan. We have Zaki Daryabi, who is the publisher of Etelat-e-Roz newspaper, who had to flee the country in last October. And we also have Deborah Amos, who's the Ferris Professor of Journalism in residence at Princetown University, an award-winning, experienced journalist with NPR. And, you know, we know her particularly from her Middle East coverage and coverage of refugees. So thank you all very much for coming. I'm going to ask some questions of all four of our panelists, and then I'm hoping if there's questions and answers coming in, or I can keep the conversation going, I'm sure for as long as we have. So I wanted to start with Zaki Daryabi, and to ask you, I mean, you had quite a traumatic time last year, but you've continued to publish Etelat-e-Roz, which is one of the foremost newspapers and now websites. And I wonder if you could just maybe tell us a little bit about what life has been like for you and your colleagues, and how you're managing to keep going with reporting on what's going on inside Afghanistan.
Hello all, thank you very much, Afghanistan Policy Lab and the panelists for hosting this important panel. We face a lot of problem after a year of fall of Kabul. Etelat-e-Roz is still struggling with evacuation of its staff. We have around more than 10 journalists who are still inside the country, in the regional country, and there's no way for them to relocate them to another safe country. They have published a lot of reports, important reports on in Afghanistan. Their names are in the database. Their names are publicly available in many websites and many reports. So still, this is a matter for Etelat-e-Roz, how we can help them. Then the second, most of the Etelat-e-Roz team who was working for more than decades with Etelat-e-Roz or many years have left the country, and they are separated in European countries, Canada, Australia, in the US, and also in many other countries. Most of them are not working anymore with Etelat-e-Roz because we do not have enough budget to hire them again. And it's a big matter for Etelat-e-Roz. We feel like we lost a big capacity. Many professional journalists that we had in the past, and now we do not have them with us to contribute with the reporting from Afghanistan. And I feel sorry about this. Then the second, the third thing is that after a year, Etelat-e-Roz established its newsroom in the US. We have our office in the US. We are registered in the US. Many of colleagues are working from Canada, from US, from Spain, from Italy, from Pakistan with us. And also we established a number of journalists inside of Afghanistan, and they are covering 34 provinces of Afghanistan for Etelat-e-Roz. Around 20 or more than that are located in Afghanistan, but they are working anonymously with Etelat-e-Roz in a very, very dangerous situation. They cannot tell their names. They cannot announce they are working with Italat Rus. And unfortunately, Italat Rus is one of the media that the Taliban try to find its journalists, and they are trying to know who are working with Italat Rus because of the independent reporting that we had in the past months, in the past year, and also for the covering the stories that the Taliban don't want to be published and don't want to the people in the world know about. So it's a fortunate thing that beyond many problems that we had in the past year, now we are established newsroom and we are covering dozens of news report from Afghanistan. But I think there is still a lot of problems that will come in the next month or probably a year, because every day, every month, you see that a lot of limitations come from the Taliban against independent media and independent reporting. They are following the journalists. They are trying to ban the independent media. They want to have just only state media or the media that are working under the Taliban role and authority. So for us, it's a matter of professionalism, how we can be independent, how we can be professional, and how we can reach to the news that the Taliban and the government trying to be hidden from the people. So I think it's a kind of transition, and I feel like still Italat Rus is not so much sustainable as we should be. We feel like we are moving from a situation that we had before the fall of Kabul to a new situation, and we do not know where is the end of this transition. This is the situation that me and the team from Italat Rus are feeling, and this is the words that I can say. Let's see what's coming next.
Thanks very much. Zahra, you've set up your Zan Times, I think just before the old republic fell, as the districts were falling. Correct me if I'm wrong. You did set up as a newsroom in exile, but with people on the ground reporting to you. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about how Zan Times is doing, and of course you're doing a PhD as well, so you're working part-time, which is quite extraordinary in its own right. But maybe you could tell us how you're getting on.
Thank you so much, Kate. First, I want to thank you, Afghan Policy, for this great panel and being able to speak about the situation of media in Afghanistan, which is very, very critical. So I want to just use this time to speak about the situation of Afghan women journalists. As you all might know, is that since the Taliban take over, women and media have been their primary target in Afghanistan. And when we are saying that when women are the primary targets of Taliban and media as well, so we have women journalists who are at the intersection of both of this repression, and they are hit the hardest. So we have reports, statistics coming from Reporters Without Borders that's saying from 5 women journalists, 4 have lost their job. And I just want to bring your attention to this, that what that really means in a country that women are denied their basic human rights to be able to go to school, to be able to work, to be able to leave their house without a male chaperone. At this kind of situation, we have attempts that women journalists are being disappeared from the Afghan media landscape. And we know that they're being systematically denied the rights to work in the media. And at least in 11 out of 34 provinces of Afghanistan, there is no women journalist working. So how do we really know what's happening for women in Afghanistan when we don't have women journalists working on the ground? And also we know that the situation is very sensitive when you're covering women's stories in Afghanistan, most of the time, men journalists are not able to access the lives of women in Afghanistan. And it's very, very critical to be able to report on what's happening when women are confined, when women and girls are confined in their houses. Even before the Taliban take over, we know that 95% of violence against women were taking place in the house. How is the situation now? How are women doing now that they're confined in their houses and the de facto authority won't allow them to leave their house without a male chaperone? And there is absolutely no system to protect them, to be able for them to register their claims of what is the violation that are happening against them. So at this time, as a woman journalist, we just say what we can do, because this was a guilt on our shoulders. I'm a woman journalist who finished her school in Afghanistan, who went to university in Afghanistan and became a journalist in Kabul. What is my responsibility if I'm not able to bring those voices to the world and say what is really happening for women in Afghanistan? So there was a group of women journalists. We talked together and we shared this frustration of how guilty we feel and how we feel we are responsible, that we have to do something. It's our responsibility to share the story of Afghan women, to be able to support our sisters in Afghanistan who are empty-handed or facing the Taliban, who are armed to the teeth. How can we bring their voices to the table here? There might not be so many people who are interested to listen, because Afghanistan is now a sad story, unfortunately. But we have to tell these stories, because this is our rights to be able, even if nobody's listening, we want to be able to bring the story of Afghan women to at least some platform for those who are interested to follow. So Zan Times was born out of a collective group of Afghan women coming together and deciding that this is our responsibility to bring those voices, and we want to do this. And so since we were journalists in newsroom and not in boardrooms, we are not connected with any sources of funding and with any power holders. So people don't know our name. And as you know, the politics of giving funding is that people have to know you, that you have to have an NGO. And when you don't have those, so they would say, sorry, we don't have heard your name. We can help you. But we said, okay, we can run, we can volunteer, all of us. So we are now a group of women, mainly women journalists, working in different countries, from Europe, US, Canada, different parts of the world. And also a group of women journalists, mainly women journalists inside the country. And the way we are doing is that we understand the situation is very, very different. Now our newsroom is almost 3 months old now. And in 3 months old, how we did function is that, unfortunately, we are not able to allow our colleagues to work with their real names. So even they don't know each other who are working in Afghanistan, we are not able to bring them in one platform, because that would put their security at risk. They work, but without getting the real credit for their works, because they are writing under pseudonym, right? And that is the situation, because if we put their real name, we are risking their lives. So these days, when we're working on a story, it's not about how to protect our sources, but how to protect our source and how to protect our journalists. So that is the situation which we are trying to operate. And at the same time, the way that we approach is we know that we have to be able to have women journalists. If we don't have them, we don't know what's happening. Then how to support them when they are not able to leave their houses? So we want to ensure that they have the ability to work from their houses, to be able to report on their community, that what is happening in their community, because they are there, they know what's happening, so they can report it. However, we need to bring all these voices together and also to train them, because most of the journalists who are working are left the country. So we need a new generation of women journalists. And we know the Taliban actually recently denied in many universities, they denied, the public university, they denied women from studying journalism. So that's a real sign that they don't want to have women journalists on the ground. So what we can do as a Zan Times, Zan means woman. And Zan Times is our way of responding to the Taliban repression of women's rights in Afghanistan. That even though you're attacking us, even though that you are systematically trying to erase us from the society, from the media, we are still here and we are still talking and we are still bringing and speaking our truths. even if you're not happy with that. And also, one of the ways that we are doing is we are no longer going to the Taliban and saying, oh, this is what had happened. What do you have to say about that? Because for the past year, we witnessed, but whatever you say, the Taliban would say, this is a lie, that this is not truth. And they have done it for the past year. This is documented. So we don't need to. They are our oppressors. So the way we approach is that we say Zan Times is a newsroom that covers human rights violation in Afghanistan with a particular focus on women, LGBT, and environmental issues. These are the three topics that we see as necessary, as underreported and underrepresented in our community in Afghanistan. So we want to speak these three truths that the Taliban don't really want people to touch on that, but we are touching on that. And we are trying to do this as a professional work. And one of our hope is to be able to train a new generation of Afghan women journalists. I never been to a journalist school. I learned the work by doing it. And I am sure 100% that we can replicate, that we can bring women, we can train a new generation of women journalists in Afghanistan and enabling them to report on their community. But only if we have support. And so far, we weren't very successful in getting that support, and as Dario Abissaib also mentioned. So I just want to end my point with this, that as long as we don't have women journalists, we don't know what's really happening for women in Afghanistan who are denied their basic human rights under the Taliban.
Bravo, Zahra. That's really, I mean, both of you, Zahra and Zaki, it's inspiring to hear your words. Ali, you're in Kabul. You've got an American passport and and you're Afghan. So you're continuing to work there. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about what it's like there, you know, how journalists are surviving or not, and maybe what's the relationship now between foreign journalists and foreign media outlets and their Afghan counterparts.
You know, journalism in Afghanistan has never been easy. It wasn't easy during the Republic, and it's certainly not easy now. You know, you talk to so many people who say, you know, I left the industry either because, as Dario Abissaib and Khan Nader said, you know, they're not being funded. There are so many local media outlets that as soon as the pullout began, the US pullout began, their funding went away. So even if male or female or any journalist wanted to continue working, you know, within, I think it was the first month, something like 100 media outlets closed in Afghanistan. And at that point, that was before a lot of the really hardcore sort of limitations that they placed. At that point, that was an immediate response to not having money. And that's still a major issue for, you know, yes, the big outlets have survived, the Tolos, the Aryanas, the Shamshads, but, you know, smaller ones are closing all the time. And, you know, people who had experience in the media, who had experience in journalism, they're not able to find work now. So, you know, there's that financial component of it. And then there's also, you know, the restrictions and the limitations. Just, you know, last night, the foreign ministry spokesman for the Taliban went on this rant online saying, you know, no journalist has been killed over the last year in Afghanistan, which is like, okay, well, you were part of that. It's not to say they were the only part of it, but you were definitely a part of it. He also said that no journalist has, you know, been stopped from doing their work, which I know for a fact is not true, because it's happened to me. It's happened to, you know, when Dario Abissaib's colleagues were beaten and tortured for reporting on a small, like 10, 15 women, you know, a small protest. We were there, we covered it, you know, we talked to their colleagues. When a Tolo journalist was standing outside, you know, a very busy area of Kabul, literally just interviewing day laborers. That's all he was doing. He was just interviewing day laborers about the state of the economy. You know, he was beaten and abused and ridiculed by the Taliban. And, you know, it's ironic because in some ways they can be very accommodating and very nice. And, you know, like, for instance, after the earthquakes in Paktika and Khost, we were in the Army Corps of Paktia, you know, doing lives all day for Al Jazeera, and like they were incredibly accommodating. They gave us food, they let us ride in their cars. And we were joking that if this was the Republic, we would have been beaten or searched, you know, 12 times by now. But that was because that was good for their PR. You know, so when it's good for their PR, they have no problem. But you know, I'll give you a tiny example. And again, as you said, you know, I have 2 passports. I'm able to come and go as I please. I have a lot of privilege. But I was doing a very simple story for the National, the newspaper in the UAE, about some of these online influencers who are still here and trying to carry on with their work. And one of them was this female influencer, you know, who has a pretty big Instagram following. And she was saying, oh, can we go out on this street and take some pictures for the piece? And again, like this is, you know, this is taking pictures of an influencer. But I said, to be honest, I don't know, we could be jailed, right? Because I'm a man taking pictures of a woman on the street, and I don't want you to get in trouble. And, you know, I can't, if I get in trouble, I can't help you either. You know, it's such a simple, basic story. There was nothing political about it. There was nothing quote unquote controversial about it. So you're constantly second guessing. And I think just as important is, you know, what happens to you is one thing, but what you really don't want to happen is something to happen to your sources, to the people you speak to. That's one thing that I'm constantly afraid of. You know, even if I were to change, like for instance, if I were to change Zahra's name to Fatima, I'd be afraid if another Fatima, you know, in the area that we were talking about, got in trouble because of me. You know, I've been working on this story about IDPs from Panjshir coming to neighboring Parwan province. I changed all their names. I gave as few details as possible, but I'm still afraid that when it gets published, I don't want anything to happen to these guys. And they were obviously very careful with their words. You know, they kept saying like the ordinary Taliban are nice to us. We're only afraid of their fighting forces and whatnot. But my biggest fear in having that story published, but I want it told, my biggest story in having that fear that the story published is that these guys will suffer because of me. So it's a really odd, you know, I mean, the Taliban in general, it's a very odd situation. You know, we're talking about, you know, like, for instance, you're talking about like teenage girls in schools, you know, they can go to private courses, they can go to home schools that like people have to get permission from the Taliban. They can go to a madrasa, they can go to a masjid to study, but then they can't go to a government-run high school. And so many of their provisions are like that. You know, like you can cover these things, but you can't cover these things. You can say these things, but you can't say these things. There's all these weird sort of loopholes and inconsistencies with their policies. So you're always worried about overstepping in one way or another.
That sounds very familiar. The desire to get stories out, to get what you consider to be truthful out, and also really, really worrying about your sources, interviewees, and for Zaki and Zahra, the colleagues. It's a really narrow path to try and tread. Thanks very much, Ali. And finally, Deborah. So what do you make of all this? I mean, is there anything that Afghan media could have done before the fall of the Republic to try and protect themselves? How are they doing compared with other media scenes in other countries that you've worked in? Maybe you can.
So, you know, my relationship with Afghanistan goes back a long way. I was there in the 80s. I was there when the Soviets pulled out. And last year I taught a course. All of my students were following as the Afghans came here and began to live in military bases. I had to start calling around to find out what I was going to say today. Thank you, Ali. We spoke for an hour last night. I'm glad you got to tell your own story. It's interesting when you talk to individual journalists. Handcuffed and blind is what Najibullah Qureshi told me. And it is sad to hear, because this was one of the great success stories in Afghanistan. You know, there is no real government in exile, but there certainly is journalism in exile, and it deserves our support. And as a member of the Overseas Press Club, we gave 33 grants to Afghan journalists. They applied to us. We gave them $4,000. And I now think that it was such a paltry bit of support that this is the time that we as the journalism community in the United States should be promoting what all of you are doing. We stop paying attention. Ali, it's not just that you can't sell stories that aren't bashing the Taliban and are about influences, as you told me yesterday, but we just stopped paying attention as your colleagues here. And I know that when I brought this story back to the Overseas Press Club yesterday, we had a board meeting, and I said, I'm going to be on this Afghan policy workshop at Princeton, and I started telling them all of this. They went, wait, we need to do an event. I said, yeah, we do. We need to do something else besides cash. Cash is great, and it was helpful when journalists were stuck at Fort McCoy. But their immediate concerns are working. They all have to have jobs, and journalism, I hate to say it, doesn't pay the bills when you've just moved to a new country and you don't have a driver's license and your English is not perfect. And what you know is back in Kabul. So I think it is on some of us as American journalists to support this community in better ways than we are. Maybe that's a longer conversation in this policy workshop. I can think of ways to do it in newsrooms. And there were attempts in the beginning to bring Afghan journalists into American newsrooms. And I think we all need to follow up on that and see what happened to those people, and if that was an effective way to support this community. But I think we can do more than we're doing. I think we have failed Afghan journalists, and after 20 years of being there, we owe them some more.
Maybe just a quick follow-up question, Deborah. Compared to other places that you've worked in, I guess somewhere like Syria, it started with very little press and then it had its upheaval.
Correct. And what you could do, what the Syrians did is a website called Syria Deeply. Syria had citizen journalists. There wasn't a flourishing community. Afghanistan is unusual in that they had 20 years to build this remarkable system. I know there were troubles with it, Ali, and there always is, Zaki, and all of you in how journalism works. Nevertheless, you were a shining example of how it can work. The Syrians didn't have that. The Iraqis didn't have that. And so when most of those people went into exile, they all had to start all over again. And some of them are flourishing in Germany, where there's a rather large community. But I think you all have a better prospect because of what you had in those 20 years and where everybody is now. I understand that there are threats, and there are in Syria too. For the Syrians, it's about testifying in war crimes trials. For you, it's writing an article. But it's the same threats, and it does inhibit how you're going to work. But at some moment they can't threaten everybody. So the more there is, the less the threats count. And I was interested in that tweet storm yesterday from the spokesman from the ministry. I mean, how I read that was there's some room. They care. They don't like it that people are saying bad things about how they treat the media. They don't care a lot, but they care a bit, enough to open that gap a little wider, challenge them a little harder. Maybe not those on the ground, but those abroad who can push a little harder, because that, in my view, was what they were saying, that they do care.
Thanks very much. So I've been sort of listing the problems as you've all been speaking. So I've said that the basic aim to try and do journalism with an authoritarian, violent government that is seeking to clamp down on how it is presented and what people know. I'd say that's number one. Number two, finance seems to be. Number three, that sort of mass evacuation of a lot of journalists and the horrible upheaval of leaving. What Ali called the second guessing how, you know, in a situation where you're not quite sure what might get you into trouble, but it might get you into trouble. So you tend to err on the side of caution. Protecting people on the ground, for those with colleagues on the ground, or trying to get the ones out who are there and in danger, who are known about. Trying to do journalism in exile and trying to keep in touch with what's going on and how you do that while maintaining, you know, sort of the freshness of what you're doing, finding out material, being all the journalist traits of having to be impartial, accurate, getting second sources, which is really, really tricky if you're not on the ground. And finally, for women, it's double of everything. And I absolutely fully agree with Zahra that if you don't have women journalists, you don't have journalism. I mean, I had this with the BBC in 98, 99. They didn't want to send me to the Taliban-controlled Afghanistan because they thought a woman couldn't do the job. Actually, for foreign women, it's somewhat easier because we're not a threat to anyone. So we can actually do both sides of the story. We're in somehow a fortunate position. But it's a struggle, and it's a sort of psychological struggle as well, Zahra. If you're female, leaving the house in an environment where people keep telling you to stay inside, cover your face, it's also somehow maintaining that public role, even if it's anonymous. It's really, really tricky. So it's a really difficult situation. I mean, I guess what Deborah put to, which is somehow the one advantage that Afghans and Afghan journalists have is that the memory of a good, thriving journalist scene is very recent. Somewhere like Iraq and Syria, people did not have that. They only had very, very dull state-sanctioned media. Afghanistan at least has that fresh memory of what journalism can be like, and Afghans, as we know, like their news, they like their stories. So having summed up all the problems, some of you have spoken about things that you could do. Financial support came up very, very much to the forefront. I mean, I don't want to talk about practical solutions because that's really sort of dismissive and underplays all the horrible problems that journalism faces. But is there anything that would make things better apart from the Taliban behaving themselves better? I don't know if who would like to answer that first.
I think.
Zahra, go ahead.
I think Ali wanted to respond. Maybe Alijan, you go. Then
Go ahead.
Okay,
No, go ahead.
I think one of the practical things that is possible, for example, when we did the hiring post, we said that we are hiring and we are prioritizing women journalists. We received 533 applications from inside Afghanistan from journalists, and 150 of those are coming from women journalists in the country. However, with our personal saving and the little money that we have, of course, we can hire them. And we can never expect them, never ask them to work for free or do volunteers, because that is, as I believe it, exploitation, to ask people who are hungry, who don't have food, who are suffering, to work for you free. And if that means that we are not able to cover the news, I think that's how we should be doing. But we can expect the people who are suffering the most, who are living, and especially journalists who are living their lives at line to bring those stories, to ask them to work for free is, I think, absolute level of exploitation, and we should be standing against that. However, there is ways to support, and I think, as I earlier mentioned, because most of the times then the initiatives are working out. For example, like our newsroom, Zan Times, we are all journalists. So I was never a media personnel. I was never a media leader. So what I did was all reporting. So, and I'm not connected with anybody and didn't have NGO. And when I go try to, first of all, I really have difficulty of finding the language of how should I talk with a donor, of like what should I put in there to make sure that they're giving me money, right? Because I'm not coming from that background. So it's difficult for me to imagine what they're asking me for. First of all, that is a challenge for us. What I can do is I can produce journalists. I can do the work. I can connect with the people inside the country. I can train them. I can bring them on the page of like, how should we doing this story in a way that is minimizing the risk. I never can say that it's possible to not have a risk in Afghanistan. Every story you work in Afghanistan have like so many levels of, as Ali John mentioned, there's so many levels of risk that you can never anticipate that which might come up. However, you can try to minimize the risk. And what we are doing right now, I see that as an example of trying to do that. First of all, not having like the people who are connected in Afghanistan, they shouldn't be knowing each other, because if the Taliban cut one of them, that's a way to find other people. And when you're working on critical topics like women's rights, like LGBT rights, you know that the Taliban is on your back. So if they cut one of your colleagues, that is a way to find the rest of your team. And one way is to protect them is to not, so they don't know anybody else, their colleagues inside the country, and also provide them with the internet technology that's not traceable by the Taliban. And also there is so many sort of way, I can give you so many recommendations. However, it's very difficult to ask for it, like who would be able to provide us with that, the need that we have. And most of the time I really feel bad of just asking people, hey, we are doing this work and we really need support, because that really seemed that what so many years we have done in Afghanistan, we are playing our role, and we really expect that the people who really care about Afghanistan, who have a stake in Afghanistan, who were in Afghanistan for the past 20 years, claiming that they were liberating Afghan women, to stand there, at least if you haven't done the job in the past 20 years, be able to support our work now, that would be great. But as I said, there is so many difficulty around it and to get that out. Thank you.
Kate, you're muted.
Thanks, Deborah. Ali, would you like to add something?
How do I put this? I think it's very, we've had a problem over the last year in terms of what's being said in the media, and especially in social media about Afghanistan, in that there can be a lot of fake news. There can be a lot of things that aren't accurate or don't paint the entire picture. And the reason I say this, I'm not saying the situation is good. The reason I say this is because the last thing we wanted to do is to open a doorway for the Taliban. So for instance, when we say that no girls are going to school, no women are working, no one is leaving the house, no one is traveling, that's dangerous because it's not accurate to the current situation. People are taking these risks and they are doing this, women are working in banks and in cell phone companies and in the airlines and in certain ministries and so on and so forth. But I think when we don't present that, that leaves a door to the Taliban, because they, in their minds, they will think, well, everyone thinks we don't let them work anyway, so what does it matter if we shut this down too? And if we keep them from this as well. So, and also like, if, there are reports that cannot be confirmed properly, unfortunately, because we see they're very retaliatory. Professor Amos brought up how the Taliban foreign ministry seems to want to work with the press. I kind of feel like it's the opposite, because I remember when certain foreign journalists were kicked out, the spokesman was more than happy. He was excited. He was like, did you see I kicked this person out? And I said, you gave them a platform now. You did the opposite. You made them more visible now. If you really wanted to somehow present your side or whatever, just refute their stories. What is the advantage to kicking somebody out? All that does is create more bad press for you. So I think that that's very, very important, is because Afghanistan is not a monolith. Life has to go on. People, try and move on with their lives. And I think if we can show that from time to time, like for instance, like there's all these reports of elders in different provinces in Kandahar and Paktiyan and Badghis and Farah and so on and so forth, saying we want teenage girls to go back to school. I think that that's extremely important to get as much attention as possible, because it shows the Taliban that their narrative that, oh, Afghan people don't want their girls to school. That's a lie, you know? Or the fact that people are willing to set up home schools to educate girls and women, which means they have to go to the intelligence of the Taliban and get permission, deal with that, you know, scary prospect. Again, it sort of goes against that Taliban narrative. So I think accuracy is very important. Also, really quickly, what you said about the exodus, the one thing that you know, always made me so happy about the Afghan media is that it's always been run by young people, you know, very young, 20s, 30s, so on. And also, I was shocked that, like, after August 15th, you know, yes, a lot of big famous journalists left, but other ones came in their place. And there are still other ones willing to do it, which is, again, why I'm saying funding is so important and continuing to support them is so important, because even with all of the limitations that the Taliban places on, like, people are afraid now after an attack to call a hospital because a hospital may not be willing to give you the numbers. You know, that's a very real thing. But despite that, I'm shocked at the number of, like, young men and women like Zahra said, you know, she had like 500 applicants. That just shows that that drive still exists. So it's really important to find as many ways as possible to make it safe, you know, because the more excuses we create for the Taliban to limit the media, the more they'll take advantage of it. But also to create the opportunities to give people the financial incentives to be able to do this work. So I hope that made sense.
Yeah, I just want to say one thing, Ali. I didn't mean to say that the Taliban wanted to cooperate with the media, not at all. But what I'm saying is, when they feel it necessary to do a tweet storm, you have to kind of try to figure out what is that about. And my sense of what it was about is there is a tiny crack in. They don't like it when people say that they beat up journalists. They don't. So, you know, so I think that it just means there's a little space to make that crack wider. And that's all. It's not a lot. I'm not saying it's a lot because I see what they do. But in other repressive regimes, you watch for that stuff to see, okay, is there a way that we can deal with them?
Yep. Zaki, would you like to respond to that question?
I think what Zahra and colleagues mentioned, all are important. But when you are managing a team of more than 20 journalists inside Afghanistan, I think the civility is the first thing that coming in your mind. We at Italatrus every day feeling with a lot of stress, what's happening with our journalists. And every day you are waking with the fear that should not happen something bad with your journalists inside Afghanistan. So anytime during the night, during the day, you are thinking about what's happening with your staff inside Afghanistan. I think what we need is to have a kind of work about their safety. We need to have somewhere inside Afghanistan to, when a journalist facing a real danger, we can relocate them inside Afghanistan from one province to another province. And beyond that, I think what we need is to have a regional hub for the Afghan journalists who are facing risk inside Afghanistan, to move them to a regional country. This is what we really need. And I think in next months, we will face much more problem because Taliban is following journalists. They knew that from Afghanistan in 2 decades, what remain in the country is the brave women who are protesting against them in the society, and the media that is still covering a lot of issues that Taliban don't want to be cover. This is one thing that we feel that is very necessary. Then the second thing is what Zahra mentioned, we are losing women journalists in the country. And it's not just about now that, for example, Italatrus have 20 journalists, women journalists with the team, and they are covering women issues from Afghanistan. Let's see if the Taliban remain for more than 5 years, if the girls don't go to school, if the girls don't have the right to choose to study Faculty of Journalism in Afghanistan, then what's happening next 5 years? we do not have any woman journalist, and we do not have any educated woman who can work with the media. So how we can think to bring this issue as an important thing, like how, for example, Princeton University or other universities can work with the African media to have a kind of practical program for them for 1 year, for example, to teach them virtually or online journalism. This is what I feel like we really need to think about, and we should come together to have a 200 women journalists in the next 5 years, while the Taliban trying to ban them from the work. This is what we feel when we are talking in Italatros with our women team. They are feeling that. So now we have 20, now we have 12. What about next 5 years? While the girls don't have the right to go to journalism faculty. Then the second thing, what Deborah mentioned, I think is very important. That's citizen journalism. How we can move to citizen journalism, while we feel like probably Italatros or other media can't hire next year any more journalists inside of Afghanistan, because it's a ethical question for you as a manager. Do you hire a journalist again while you know that he or she can face in danger? So you are thinking how you can move your news to a citizen journalism-based newsroom. And this is what we have a lot of hope actually about this, because at least Italatros receive dozens of news every day from the citizens around the country with the video, photo, and many other things. And dozens of millions of young people are trusting in the media, and they are working with us, they are collaborating with us. How we can improve this? This is something that we should think about. And the third thing, what Overseas Press Club did with some fellowship with the Afghan journalists who just left the country. We need to have more fellowship for the Afghan journalists who left the country, and they have a lot of expertise. I feel like Italatros do not have the professional in the capacity in a backbone that you can stand on that, because now many news that are coming from the country, from inside country, we know that it's not something that we should publish. So you are working again to bring it to be published. Why we should not focus with the journalists who have the capacity, and we should not we should hire them, we should work with them. Unfortunately, many good journalists of Afghanistan is not now working with Amazon, Uber, and many other things. While we really need their experience in this period of transition to sustainable journalism and good quality journalism in the future. These are my points. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I'm afraid my internet went for a while. I've lost all the questions that you were sending in. Maybe I can I'm going to ask one little question to Ali before summing up, because we're coming to the end of our hour together. Ali, I'm a foreign journalist who worked in Afghanistan during the first Taliban emirate. And that solidarity with there were 4 independent journalists in the country. There was me at the BBC, and there were 3 Afghans working for the news agencies who managed to keep impartial, accurate news coming out of the country. Not much else was happening because there wasn't even a telephone system at that time. But there was a lot of solidarity between us. We supported each other. If there was a difficult question to ask, I would ask the question, because the Taliban wouldn't arrest me. In the end, I got, one of my colleagues was arrested and had to leave, and I was exiled in the end. So, but while it happened, there was a lot of solidarity. In August, I think pretty well all the major bureaus shut down. In retrospect, that seems like a really hasty and unhelpful move, even if it maybe was understandable at the time. But has that changed the media landscape for Afghan journalists?
Yes,
That
because
lack
a lot
of
of
the big beasts in the jungle being really committed to Afghanistan and being there.
Yeah, I think for two reasons. One, I think the New York Times or Washington Post is more comfortable to take on riskier topics, right? So you have sort of that backing, and you can always refer to, oh, well, the Washington Post said this, the Wall Street Journal said, do you know what I'm saying? As sort of like, even if the Taliban come after you, you can be like, well, they reported it first, I got it from them, And the other thing is that a lot of, and this is something that I want to say about what Zaki came back to, is that, a lot of Afghan journalists learned so much from working with these foreign outlets, and then they were able to go on and, start their own or move on to different outlets and things like that. And I think, if we're talking about retaining Afghan journalists in the United States, I don't think we only have to have them covering Afghanistan. They have so many skills now. They have such an understanding of how to tell news from, personal, local perspectives, from community perspectives, that there's no reason that, you can't have an Afghan journalist who grew up, writing about Afghanistan start to branch out and write about, different communities in the United States at a time when midterm elections are coming. That only helps the skill. That only helps their marketability. And that's, if you're worried, oh, well, not every newsroom in the country needs an Afghanistan reporter, fine, have them work on Afghanistan a certain percentage of the time, but then they're unbelievably skilled and adept and, proficient. There's no reason that, they can't teach you something about West Virginia that someone else might not have seen, So I think that that's another sort of answer to this problem, is that, bring Afghan journalists into your newsroom and don't just limit them to Afghanistan. Obviously, let them cover that, when there is good, reliable information, but also, help them expand their skills and cover all kinds of things, so that in the future, they are even more marketable in a journalism market.
I think we lost Kate for the time being with her network connection, but Deb, do you have any reflection on that? I'm just trying to cover for Kate until she is back.
Until she comes back to us. I completely agree with you, Ali. In the beginning, I thought that we had that. I saw so many notices of journalism schools taking on Afghan journalists, of newspapers doing the same. And then it kind of petered out. I don't really see much of it anymore. And that's why I was saying before that I think we all have to find a way to have panels to raise the visibility of all of you. I mean, Zaki, I think that there's a whole bus full of Princeton students who are coming your way on Friday. And hopefully some of that material, will get out and about. I have to say, I didn't know about the newspaper. I didn't know about AMU TV. This is all new to me. And if I don't know it, I think it's our duty to just give you more visibility. We just have to sit and figure out how to do that.
And we are approaching the last minutes of our conversation, which I truly enjoyed every part of it. And I've been also receiving comments in terms of how insightful this discussion was. But we do have a Q&A session, and we have received a few questions, and I hope we will get time to answer them. But the first one, I think, is really critical. It's from one of our colleagues, one of our fellows at the lab, from Mr. Wahid Wafa. And his question is that how can we sell these stories to the West that currently is almost deaf towards Afghanistan and its suffering? And we also have another question from Hana Kapoor, one of the students at Princeton University. And the question is, what is the most unique aspect of the Afghan media landscape? How Afghan citizens conceptualize and value the notion of press freedom? I think that's really important, because I think Ali was saying that how perceptions are important, especially in the West, about Afghanistan. And Kate was also reflecting that how it is important for people of Afghanistan to have access to media and free media.
And she also continues to ask the question, how would you describe Taliban's approach to censorship and propaganda? So these are, I think, really heavy and big questions. And I leave it, I think maybe I will start with Zahra first, and then I will give it to Zaki and Ali. And I think Deb, to you as well. And I think to you, there is one big question we all have is, how do we learn the lessons from other countries when it arrives to a situation where media freedom is truly threatened in Afghanistan, and we have this ability and strength in local media and Afghan citizens and their ability, and here we are. And Zara was also discussing and saying how much resources are extremely limited. What do you think was the best or effective model that had worked before? And how can we reflect on that model, and could we replicate it to the case of Afghanistan? So I leave it to, I start with Zahra, and then I give it to Ali and Zaki, and then Deb to you.
Thank you so much, Adela John. I want to start with this question of how to sell these stories to the Western audience. So when I joined the New York Times, it was like 2016, and my bureau chief, Rod Norton, tweeted that I was the first Afghan woman to actually work with them full time. So my question is, the US and the Western countries were in Afghanistan for 20 years. If I was the first Afghan woman to actually work with them in 2016, like who were telling them their story before then, you know? That's a question that we have to really ponder, and it's up to Western audience to question the narratives that are bringing to them. There's always a sense of that if a Western journalist is reporting their story, that's more accurate, more believable, more credible than an Afghan journalist doing it. I think that's very, very, for us, sort of not acknowledging our experience, of not really seeing who we are, the work that we are bringing. And I personally experienced that myself. When I moved to Canada in 2017, I wanted to remain a journalist. I wanted to continue my work. But what the sense that I get was, excuse me, your experience is not Canadian. You have Afghan experience. That doesn't help us here. That's not so much of a journalism experience, right? They sort of treat you as a secondary, you know, you're not really a journalist because you're experienced it in Afghanistan, and we don't accept that. So that's one question of like, how we do really sell them stories. It's a very question that I always struggle with, because sometimes I hear from friends that, oh, you have to write a story like the Western does. And my question is that my sense, I am coming from that place. I live there. I know the culture. I know the language. Also, it's not monolithic. My experience is not applicable to all experience of Afghan women. They have different experience. But speaking as a journalist, I always want to really say that I feel that we will bring more richer stories from Afghanistan, because we know the background, we know the culture, and the sensitive issues. That sometimes I feel that the Western audience or the Western journalists might not know who, most of them sometimes, sort of go there for one story or two story, and then they don't have no experience. And I really get a lot of this sense from other people who work with the Western media in Afghanistan. They're saying that, they don't really acknowledge our work. And sometimes, most of the times, the Afghan journalist is doing the work, but at the end, they're not getting the credit they deserve. Mm-hmm. And I feel that we don't really need to sell them their story. We have to bring their story. We have to do our work. If they're not listening to us, if that's, I think, not our problem, because the problem that we are seeing in Afghanistan is not our decision. We never made the decision. What's happening for the past 40 years in Afghanistan, I feel, was not so much informed by the decision of Afghan people, but it was a decision that made for us. Mm-hmm. And we are the one living the consequence of those decisions that other people make for us. And we really hope that they do have this sense of responsibility to really look back and see what they have created for us and what misery the Afghan people are living in today, and what consequence the decision that we never made, and we are living it. So that's one part. I think we have to tell our story. We have to tell our truth. If if even Western audience and they don't care, we have to tell our story. This is our version of history. This is our version of truth that we lived. No matter if they're listening or not, we have to tell our story, and this is part of our history. About the media freedom, and also about this, Alijan earlier mentioned about, so there is women going out, there is different situation, but I want to be clear about that the Taliban have policies. They said women are not, for example, teenage girls are not allowed to go to school. But if they do go to school, I think that is a sort of resistance. Women are not allowed to leave their house without male chaperone, but they do leave their house without male chaperone. That is their resistance. This is not the Taliban policy allowing them to leave. But this is how Afghan people and Afghan women are resisting to their policies. And we know even last year, in September, they banned and approved protests, right? Gatherings and protests. And most of those protests, women are doing it. They do still come to the streets, even though it's against the Taliban policies. I see that as a source of resistance of Afghan women, of Afghan people fighting back for their rights, not so much of the Taliban giving them space, because we know, like, anytime women go to the streets, Taliban came and shoot in the air and, electric shock them and in so many ways, and arrest them and torture them. And we have so many of those stories that we are aware. So I think we have to really see like how, the Afghan, that there's a policy that the Taliban implement, and there is the resistance of the people trying to fight it back. So that should be separated and seen differently. And also about the media freedom. We know for the fact that the Taliban, any critical news, any critical information that came out of Afghanistan, not only from Afghan media, but also credible reports from the UN, from the Human Rights Watch, from other places. So far, the Taliban was like, this is a lie. This is not true. This is absolutely baseless. So we know for a fact that there is, from the Taliban, there's always an attempt of saying that we only accept the media that promote us. That is sort of our propaganda and PR. And they're allowed those. So except that one, I think we don't have so much hope that the media can survive, but inside under the Taliban role. But still, I really see sometimes when I follow the news, I still see so much resistance from the journalists who are still working under the Taliban. And I really, really, like I just say, they're so much brave for doing this, because that is putting their lives at risk. And Afghan journalists are doing that every day. Every news that they bring, this is at the cost of their own lives. And we have to really acknowledge that. And we have to really find a way to first protect them and also enable them to continue their work. Because when I talk to women journalists, I tell them, like, what should I do? You're at risk. If you do cover this story, that's going to cost your life. You know what they told me? Hey, I'm already living this risk. I need support to continue my work, to be able to put food on the table for my family, and also have a purpose to look for the future. And if I don't have that purpose, how should I live? I think that's the most important part that we should not forget, that when they don't have a purpose to live, that's even more harder than the not having food to eat.
Thank you, Zahrajan. And very briefly and quickly, Zakijan and Alijan, and then you're going to sum it up for us. Daria Viseb, any final words on this?
What Zahra told, I think, was very clear about the questions that just come in the chat. One thing that is really important for Afghanistan media and the future of freedom is that when we're talking with the Taliban, especially the international community, the diplomatic engagement that is happening between countries and states with the Taliban, we should not just stand with the women rights in going girls to the school. This is the only thing that we want from the Taliban. The future of freedom of expression, the safety of journalists are not in the agenda. How we can bring this in the diplomatic engagement with the Taliban, this is, I think, very necessary. Banning the girls from school is a big matter of Afghanistan, but it's not the only. What we want from the Taliban is only one thing, while the people of Afghanistan and the citizens don't have the right to live. They are doing anything with the people inside Afghanistan, and we do not tell anything. So I think we need this kind of engagement with the Taliban. And then what we are doing is reporting what's happening inside Afghanistan. I think it's not a big issue for us how we can sell these stories in the West. This is something much important than this, that how we can reporting alive and how we can archive what's happening while the Taliban is running power in the country. What the people is suffering, what are the matters for them. This is the big responsibility that we face, and I think other organizations, other institutes can be the voice to raise these questions and these things in the West and to tell the story. Media is reporting, and many policy labs and research centers can use these numbers and facts to sell what's happening inside Afghanistan.
Thank you. Ali John, your final words, because we're running out of time, sorry.
Very quickly, I just wanted to clarify, like Zara Jad, my point about people going out was exactly that there is resistance going on, that people are not submitting, that really this time it is different. People aren't coming out from a civil war this time. People saw changes, they saw advances, they saw things that they hadn't seen, and now they're willing to stand up and, like I said, just even going out on the street is a risk, just going out and dressing how you want as a woman, because there are still women who don't wear the chadari, who don't wear the niqab, but that is a risk in and of itself. And that is, as she said, an act of resistance. Same thing with a man dressing a certain way and so on. So there's that. And I think it comes back to this idea of how do you sell a story in the West? This is the problem, is that in the West, selling a quote unquote positive story or something that has a little bit of nuance about Afghanistan is extremely difficult. But at the same time, if you're just selling, repeatedly doom and gloom stories, that's going to lose your audience as well, because people are going to be like, oh, another Afghanistan story, another tragedy. Why do I want to keep reading about tragedy? And then especially when they'll be like, oh, you could look at Ukraine, look at this, look at Elon Musk about Twitter, all kinds of, things that are vying for people's attention. And then the one thing I wanted to get back to is the perception of the media in Afghanistan. And this is what I've always found fascinating. First of all, Afghanistan is one of the only countries in the world where I have seen young boys and girls come up to me and say, when I grow up, I want to be a journalist. I never saw that in the United States. I didn't see that in Qatar. I didn't see that in Turkey. But I see it in Afghanistan to this very day. And that's amazing. And the Afghan people have an unbelievable respect for the media and for journalists. And I don't want to bring it back to tragedy, but I remember a few years ago when there was an attack that essentially targeted journalists in Shashtarak and Kabul. Everybody I saw after that came apologizing to me and saying, we love journalists, you're our future, you're our hope, you're our honor, you're our pride. You would never see that in the United States. You've all been there now for a long time. You see that does not exist there. There is not this affinity for the media. But unfortunately, in Afghanistan, especially over the last 7-8 years, the authorities have always had a hostile attitude towards the media. In the old republic, I remember high-level people saying, oh, why don't we shut down Tolo? Why don't we shut down Itilat Rose? Who does this journalist think they are? You can't criticize the president, and so on and so forth. But the people still stood up for the journalists, and they still defended them. And so this is why keeping the Afghan media going is so important. Anything that can be done to keep that going, and to use, as I said earlier, to use that skill, bring the Afghan journalists to your local newsroom and have them cover your local community stories in Washington and in California and so on and so forth, because they'll bring a unique insight into it. So that's it. That's my statement.
Thank you.
I'll be quick. As I listen to all of you and as I've dug into this topic, I think what you need is a narrative change. You are not the sad losers of what happened in August 2021. You actually are reconstituting a community. You are setting up a media landscape here. It makes me think about the Syrians in Germany who used to be covered as just refugees. They were trouble. Some people liked them, some people didn't. Now there are stories about them organizing workshops so that you can run for parliament as soon as you get your passport. There are Syrian journalists in Germany. Watch Deutsche Welle in English. I see it all the time. Different kind of stories about that community. You're just at that moment where you could have those stories written about you. I mean, Zahra, I read Zan Times. There's great stories there. They should have legs. They should move. They should have bigger profiles. And so that is your challenge right now, is to change the narrative about who you are here and what you're doing. It's not an easy thing to do. And sometimes it just takes time for journalists to come find you. I did, because I'm here, and I will tell all of my friends that they ought to look at this as a story. So that would be my advice. And I don't know how you change narratives. Maybe we all have another one of these and we figure it out.
Thank you. Thank you, Deb. Thank you, Zahra John. Thank you, Ali. Thank you, Dario Bisep. You all are doing wonderful work. I think there is no words sincerely to describe the bravery and the commitment and the type of news stories you share with all of us here. And the Afghanistan Policy Lab at the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs is very honored to having you for this conversation. It is a very critical and it's a very important discussion. In our very humble way, we wanted to highlight, as you said, and balance the narrative that exists here, if it is to bring to the highlight and to the focus of a lot of people that Afghanistan and its stories are still relevant and critical and important for our lives and for our work and for our policies as well. And at the same time, as you said, it's not that yes, everything was difficult and lost, but I think here we are. We have this 20 years of investment, this younger generation, this really critical media outlets there, and still people work with risks and a lot of challenges in Afghanistan and still help us to hear the stories that we really do need to hear. And I think the broader question that's really important today, we're dealing with a regime that there is no way to keep them accountable. And I think in a society where there is no element of democracy, I think the only hope that society can have is the media in the ground to create awareness and somehow, if it's possible, bring those who are in power right now to listen to the public and to the civil space if it could ever get stronger and more strengthened. And I also wanted to do my final pitch here at Princeton at the Afghanistan Policy Lab. We have put together a news bulletin, as you said, Zahra John and Zaki John and Ali and Dabiu, that how important it is that the news of Afghanistan to be still circulated in the most credible and respected way. Because I think the West media, yeah, definitely covers the stories, but there are so many important stories in the local media that it never gets translated into the Western media. So I have to tell you, Zahra John, Zan Times is there constantly in our stories because you do cover what is important. And we share that bulletin every morning on Monday, 8:30. So please, if you would like to join our subscription, do join, and we will send you a very short summary of what had happened in Afghanistan and that week before. And I've heard a lot of great comments that I received from everybody, and I hope you will also enjoy it. So we sum up our conversation today, and with one hope that we would be able to get the attention of policymakers, donor society, our own Afghan media and journalists to find sustainable and critical way to still help us out, those who are here out in the West and those who are inside the country, and our gratitude to the bravery of those who are inside and still helping us out to hear the stories. And thank you, Deb, for summing it up for us. And thank you again, Zahra John, for your work, and Ali, yours, and Dario Bisep, and thanks to our participants and colleagues who joined us and raised their critical and important questions. We hope to get back to you for those who were not able to answer their questions. Thank you again. This was a wonderful panel. Grateful.